Rich CEO discovers a girl. Sleeping on cardboard, the truth about her identity left him stunned. The night was unusually quiet in the heart of the bustling city. Tall skyscrapers glittered with lights. Yet the streets below felt deserted as Ethan Cole, the Millionaire CEO, walked through the lobby of his office tower, the marble floors echoing under his polished shoes, while security guards bowed their heads respectfully as he passed. But he hardly noticed, his eyes fixed straight ahead and his mind lost in its own storm. The glass doors slid open and the night breeze brushed against his face. Ethan adjusted his black coat. But the chill wasn't from the air, it came from the emptiness inside him. The city lights sparkled like jewels, but none of them warmed his soul. He stepped into his sleek black luxury car waiting at the curb. The driver opened the door, but Ethan waved him off and muttered quietly, "I'll drive tonight," surprising the driver, who simply nodded and stepped aside. Sliding behind the wheel, the leather seat molding to his frame, Ethan started the engine, the car purring like a beast in the silence, while the streets stretched ahead, long and glowing under the neon haze. Music played softly on the radio, but he didn't hear it. His mind replayed the board meetings, the deals, the endless faces he couldn't trust. Success had given him everything except peace. He turned a corner, the city shifting into darker, quieter streets. Storefronts shuttered, lights long gone. Street lamps flickered and threw long shadows across the pavement. His hands tightened around the steering wheel as something gnawed at him, an emptiness wealth could never fill. He sighed deeply, trying to shake the feeling. Then, out of the corner of his eye, he saw movement. His car slowed almost on its own, as in a narrow alley to his right, something caught his attention. He leaned slightly, peering through the tinted glass, and there against a brick wall was a fragile figure. A girl, no more than 18 or 19, curled up tightly, her body resting on a thin piece of cardboard, as she hugged herself like her arms were the only shield against the cold. A torn blanket barely covered her legs. The night wind cut through the alley, making her shiver. Her messy, tangled hair framed her pale face, and Ethan's chest tightened unexpectedly. He blinked, unsure why he couldn't look away. This was the city he ruled with wealth and power, yet here was someone forgotten, lying inches from survival. He gripped the steering wheel, conflicted. Normally he would drive past. He had trained himself never to get distracted, never to feel too much. But something about this girl was different. He felt a strange pull, like a whisper, urging him to stop. His heart thudded heavily in his chest as he pressed the brakes, the car rolling to a halt with a sound that startled even him. Why was he stopping? He stared at the girl again, her small frame so fragile against the rough wall, her hands trembling, fingers red from the cold. She tried to adjust her blanket, but it slipped off, and for a moment her lips moved as though she whispered to herself, though Ethan couldn't hear. The sight made him ache. He sat frozen, his breath caught in his throat. This wasn't his world of boardrooms, luxury hotels, and private jets. This was a world of cardboard beds, empty stomachs, and silent suffering. And yet this moment felt more real than any of those. Slowly, Ethan reached for the door handle, the night air rushing in as he stepped out. His polished shoes touched the cracked pavement, and the hum of his car's engine faded behind him. The girl stirred slightly, sensing movement as Ethan walked closer, his footsteps echoing softly, stopping a few feet away, unsure how to begin. She curled tighter, as if fearing he might harm her, and his throat tightened at the thought. Why would she expect kindness from strangers? He cleared his throat quietly and said, "Hey," his voice low, almost unsure, and the girl's eyes fluttered open, tired, guarded, but strikingly deep, looking up at him as though staring at a shadow. For a moment, neither of them moved. The silence stretched heavy between them. Ethan shifted slightly, his coat brushing in the wind. He saw her lips tremble and her breath uneven. "You'll freeze out here," he said softly, and the girl blinked, then looked away, her voice weak but steady. "I'm used to it." The words pierced through Ethan like ice. He had heard excuses in boardrooms, lies in negotiations, but never resignation so raw. He studied her face, pale under the faint lamplight. She was young, far too young to know this kind of suffering, and his jaw tightened as a wave of frustration surged inside him. How could the city, his city, allow this? He took a step forward. Her eyes flicked nervously, watching him, and he raised his hands slightly, showing no harm. "I'm not here to hurt you," he said gently, his voice usually commanding now almost fragile. The girl hesitated, then nodded faintly. The wind blew sharply, making her shiver again. Ethan noticed her thin sweater clinging to her body and wanted to shrug off his coat to cover her instantly, but he knew trust couldn't be forced. So he stood there, steady and present, the street around them silent, the world narrowed to this alley. He could hear her shallow breaths, each one unsteady. A stray dog barked in the distance, but she didn't even flinch. She had grown used to fear. It no longer startled her, and Ethan's chest ached as he wondered how many nights she had endured like this, how many times people had walked past without stopping. His fists clenched at the thought, yet at the same time he felt grateful. Grateful that tonight he hadn't ignored her. He crouched slightly, lowering himself closer to her level, and asked softly, "What's your name?" Her lips parted, but no sound came. She looked down, embarrassed and uncertain. He waited patiently, his eyes gentle. At last she whispered something faintly, but the words were lost in the wind. Ethan leaned closer, careful not to startle her, and said, "It's okay. You don't have to tell me right now." Her eyes flicked up, surprised at his gentleness. And in that fragile glance, Ethan felt something stir inside him, something he hadn't felt in years. Human connection. He exhaled slowly, steadying himself, and in that moment, under the dim glow of the streetlight, the night felt forever changed. Ethan remained crouched in the dimly lit alley, the silence wrapping around him as the girl finally stirred again, her thin fingers tightening around the edge of the torn blanket as if it were the last piece of safety she had left. Slowly, her eyelids lifted, revealing eyes that glistened faintly under the streetlight. Tired yet unbroken, fragile yet holding a strange depth that seemed older than her years. She blinked a few times as though trying to focus on the tall figure kneeling before her, unsure whether he was real or another cruel trick of the night. Ethan did not speak at first, afraid that even a single harsh word might shatter this fragile moment, so he simply waited, his breath held, his gaze steady. The girl studied him cautiously, her lips parting slightly as if she wanted to say something, but then closing again, her throat tightening against words long kept silent. Her hair fell in messy strands across her face, but her eyes pierced through, clear despite the exhaustion clouding them. She looked no older than 18, perhaps 19, her face pale, her cheeks hollow, and yet within her eyes there was something startling, quiet strength, a kind of resilience that did not belong to someone so young. Ethan felt it immediately, a current that ran from her gaze straight into his heart, making his chest tighten in a way he had not felt in years. He reached gently into his coat pocket and pulled out a wrapped sandwich he had taken from his office earlier, the simplest gesture he could offer in the moment. He extended it toward her, not pushing it into her hands, only holding it out with patience. But the girl's reaction was not what he expected. Her lips quivered before she whispered, almost fiercely, "I don't need pity." Her voice was faint but sharp, carrying layers of exhaustion, pride, and pain all at once. The words cut through the cold air, more powerful than the city's noise beyond the alley. Ethan froze, his hand still extended, his mind racing. It wasn't her rejection that struck him most, it was the sound of her voice. Something about it stirred a memory buried deep within him, like an echo of a place and time he couldn't quite grasp. His chest tightened as though the past was tugging at him, a forgotten melody replaying in his mind. He lowered the sandwich slowly, careful not to show offense, and instead watched her intently, listening to the faint tremble in her tone. The girl, seeing his hesitation, lifted her chin with unexpected defiance, her eyes narrowing slightly as if to challenge him. She didn't want handouts, she wanted dignity, and Ethan could see that clearly. He swallowed, surprised by how much her words affected him. He had faced ruthless businessmen, negotiators who lied with smiles, rivals who wanted nothing more than to see him fail. Yet none of their words had ever unsettled him the way hers did. He studied her eyes more closely now, noting the way they flickered between suspicion and something unspoken, perhaps hope she refused to show. The familiarity of her voice nagged at him again, like a faint song from childhood, a memory of a voice he had heard when life was simpler, softer, before the weight of money and responsibility consumed him. He tried to shake the thought, but it lingered stubbornly in his chest. "I didn't mean pity," he said softly, his voice lowering in tone, careful and deliberate. "I thought you might be hungry." The Gurachidо. Elle blinked at him, her expression shifting for just a fraction of a second, a crack in the shield she held so tightly around herself. But as quickly as it appeared, it vanished, and she looked away, her gaze dropping to the cardboard beneath her, as though the ground held more comfort than the stranger before her. Ethan tilted his head slightly, noticing the way her shoulders stiffened, the way her fingers twisted the fabric of her blanket nervously. She didn't trust him, not yet, maybe not ever. And yet, there was something undeniable in the silence between them, something that made him stay, that made him want to understand her instead of simply walking away. He found himself studying every detail of her face, the way her lashes fluttered when the cold breeze brushed against her skin, the way her lips pressed together as though holding back words she refused to release. Her pride was evident, but so was her fragility, and that contradiction fascinated him. He searched for words, but none felt right. He wanted to ask who she was, why she was here, how she had ended up like this, but he knew pushing too fast would only drive her further into her shell. Instead, he allowed the silence to linger, trusting it to bridge the space between them more than any rushed questions could. The girl finally glanced at him again, a quick, fleeting look, but enough for him to notice the storm behind her gaze. She carried a weight, one far heavier than any girl her age should bear, and though she spoke little, her eyes told 1,000 unspoken stories. Ethan leaned back slightly, giving her space, yet never breaking eye contact, and in that fragile moment he realized something that shook him deeply. This encounter was not ordinary. Her voice was not random, her presence was not accidental. Something about her was tied to him, to his past, to the part of his life he had long locked away. The night air pressed heavy between them as the echo of her whispered words, "I don't need pity," kept replaying in his mind, louder than the city, sharper than the cold, etching themselves into his memory as though destiny itself had spoken through her. Ethan remained silent for a long moment after hearing her words, the weight of her defiance still echoing in the air, but he could not simply walk away. Not now, not when something inside him felt tethered to her presence. He rose slowly from his crouch, straightening his tall frame, but instead of retreating, he extended his hand gently, not forcefully, his voice quiet yet firm as he said, "Come with me, at least for a warm meal." The girl's eyes flickered in uncertainty, suspicion clouding her expression, and she shook her head faintly as though she wanted to reject him again. But her body betrayed her pride with the faintest tremor in her stomach, a sound of hunger she could not hide. Ethan noticed it, but he did not point it out. Instead, he simply stood there, waiting, his hand steady in the cold air. The silence stretched painfully long until at last she gave the slightest nod, her voice barely audible when she whispered, "Just for food." Relief washed over Ethan, though he kept his face calm, and he stepped back respectfully to give her space as she rose unsteadily from the cardboard, her legs stiff from the cold. Together they walked out of the alley, her cautious steps echoing against the pavement while his longer strides slowed to match her fragile pace. The city lights brightened as they emerged onto the main street, neon signs flickering against the glass of high-end shops that seemed to mock the girl's worn clothing. Ethan opened the passenger door of his car, and for a moment she froze, staring at the vehicle as though it belonged to another world entirely, a world she had no right to touch. He spoke gently, "It's just a car." And though her hesitation lingered, she finally slid into the seat, her hands curling into fists on her lap. Ethan drove through the city without music, the quiet inside the car filled only by the hum of the engine and the occasional sound of her shifting nervously. After a short while, they arrived at a restaurant tucked into a quieter street, a place Ethan often used when he needed privacy away from the spotlight. He guided her inside, the warm air immediately wrapping around them, the scent of freshly baked bread drifting through the room. The girl's eyes widened slightly at the polished wooden tables, the soft lighting, the kindness in the waiters' smiles, things she had not known for far too long. They sat across from each other in a secluded corner, and for the first time Ethan saw her shoulders ease, just barely, as though the warmth of the room was slowly thawing the walls she had built around herself. A waiter approached, placing water on the table, and Ethan gently offered, "Order whatever you'd like." The girl hesitated, her lips parting then closing again, until finally she whispered, "Something simple." Ethan nodded and ordered for both of them, choosing a warm soup and bread, something gentle and comforting. As they waited, he leaned forward slightly, not with authority but with patience, and said softly, "May I know your name?" The girl lowered her gaze, her fingers tracing the edge of the glass nervously, before finally she spoke, her voice carrying the faintest tremor. "Lily." Ethan let the name linger on his tongue, repeating it softly in his mind, feeling as though it belonged to something familiar, something important he could not yet place. When the food arrived, Lily ate slowly at first, as if afraid it might be taken away, but gradually her hunger overcame her hesitation, and Ethan watched with a quiet ache in his chest. Between sips of soup, her voice began to unravel pieces of her story, hesitant at first, but then flowing like a river breaking through a dam. She told him how her mother had fallen ill, how the hospital visits drained the last of their savings, and how each day she had prayed for a miracle that never came. She described holding her mother's hand until the very end, her small body pressed against the hospital bed as though sheer closeness could keep death at bay. But when her mother's final breath slipped away, the world had collapsed into silence. Ethan's hands tightened around his glass, his jaw clenching as he listened, his heart pierced by every detail she revealed. Lily's voice wavered as she spoke of her relatives, how at first they had taken her in, but soon their kindness turned to bitterness, their words sharp, their patience thin. She became a burden in their eyes, a reminder of loss they did not want to bear, until finally they pushed her away, leaving her with nothing but the streets. Ethan leaned back slightly, his breath uneven, the memory of his own mother rising unbidden in his chest, the loneliness that had followed her death echoing painfully through him. Yet unlike Lily, he had inherited wealth, protection, the cold comfort of money to shield him from hunger and rejection. She, on the other hand, had inherited nothing but pain, abandonment, and the crushing weight of survival. He felt the sharp contrast burning within him, guilt mixing with sorrow, and he realized how fragile her pride truly was, how it had been the only armor she could carry after everything else was stripped away. Lily's eyes glistened as she finished speaking, though no tears fell. She had learned long ago to swallow them, to bury them beneath her strength. Ethan wanted to reach across the table to take her hand, to promise her she would never feel that loneliness again, but he stayed still, knowing such gestures required trust she was not yet ready to give. Instead, he offered silence, not the silence of indifference, but the silence of presence, the kind that says, "I hear you, I see you, I will not walk away." And in that quiet restaurant, with the hum of soft music in the background, Ethan felt his heart break open in a way it had not in years. Every word Lily had spoken etching itself deep into him, binding him to her pain, as though it were his own. The night after their meeting at the restaurant lingered in Ethan's mind longer than he expected, and though his days were filled with endless meetings, negotiations, and the constant hum of corporate life, his thoughts drifted back to Lily every quiet moment he could find. Her voice, her eyes, her story pressing against him like an echo he could not silence. Weeks slipped by, yet she remained carved into his memory, and with every passing day his curiosity grew heavier, not out of idle interest, but out of a gnawing need to understand why her presence felt so strangely personal, why the sound of her voice haunted him like a melody from his own past. He told himself it was compassion, that it was only natural to care about someone who had endured so much, but deep down he knew it was more. There was a thread tying her to him, invisible yet unbreakable, and he could no longer ignore it. One evening, after a particularly long day at the office, Ethan sat at his mahogany desk, the city skyline blazing with golden lights outside his window, and made a decision that shifted the course of his thoughts into action. He reached for his phone and dialed the number of a trusted private investigator, a man discreet and thorough, someone who had handled delicate matters for him in the past without question. His voice was calm but firm as he gave the instruction. Find out everything you can about a girl named Lily, age 18 or 19, no last name, start from the streets. The man agreed without hesitation, promising to return with information soon, and Ethan ended the call with a heaviness in his chest, a strange mixture of guilt and anticipation swirling inside him. The following days stretched unbearably long as he tried to bury himself in work, yet every time he signed a contract or looked across the boardroom, his mind wandered back to the image of Lily sitting across from him in that restaurant, her fragile dignity cloaked in quiet strength. At night, sleep evaded him, replaced by restless pacing in his vast empty home, the silence louder than ever. Finally, the call came. The investigator's voice was steady, but his words carried a weight that shifted the ground beneath Ethan's feet. I found her, the man said, and there's something you should know. A file arrived at Ethan's office that same evening, a thick envelope of documents, photographs and records placed carefully on his desk as if it contained not paper, but fate itself. With steady yet trembling hands, Ethan broke the seal, pulling out the first photograph. A faded image of Lily as a child, standing beside a smiling woman whose face sent a shockwave through his chest. His breath caught, his heartbeat quickened, and his hand froze midair as recognition struck him like lightning. The woman in the photograph was not a stranger. She was familiar. She was his mother's closest friend, a woman who had once walked the halls of his childhood home, who had shared meals and laughter with his family, who had stood beside them when everything seemed to crumble. Ethan's mind reeled back to a time when he was just a boy, when his family faced financial ruin and despair, and he remembered the night his mother had cried into the arms of that very woman who had given more than just comfort, who had offered help, resources and strength that carried them through their darkest days. The papers in his hands blurred as his vision clouded, the weight of the discovery sinking into him. Lily wasn't just a girl he happened to find in the shadows of the city. She was the daughter of the woman who had once saved his own family from ruin. He set the papers down, his fingers trembling against the polished surface of his desk, and leaned back in his chair, his mind spinning with the enormity of the revelation. He had walked past countless faces in his life, but fate had brought this one directly into his path, not by chance, but by design, as though the universe itself had decided to tie a knot between past and present. His mother's voice seemed to whisper in his memory, a soft echo of her gratitude for her friend, a reminder of promises unspoken but deeply felt. Ethan realized with a crushing ache that he had unknowingly crossed paths with someone his late mother had wanted him to protect, someone his family owed more to than they could ever repay. The thought brought both sorrow and urgency, a mix of guilt for not recognizing her sooner, and a fierce determination to honor the bond that connected them. He pressed his palms against his temples, his heart heavy with the realization that he could not, would not, abandon her again. Ethan sat in silence long after the revelation, the city lights flickering beyond the glass walls of his office, but his heart was no longer aligned with the rhythm of the world outside. It was pulled toward Lily, toward the truth that now demanded to be spoken. For days, he wrestled with himself, unsure of how to approach her, fearful of shattering the fragile trust she had given him, yet unable to carry the weight of the secret any longer. When the moment finally came, it was not under the grandeur of chandeliers or in the polished hallways of his empire, but in a quiet corner of the city park where he had asked her to meet him, the late afternoon sun casting long shadows across the path, as if time itself wanted to pause for their conversation. Lily arrived with cautious steps, her eyes filled with curiosity, her presence still fragile but no longer broken, and Ethan's chest tightened as he realized the depth of what he was about to reveal. He took a deep breath, steadying his trembling voice, and told her everything. The photographs, the documents, the connection between her late mother and his own, the bond, too, had existed long before she and he had ever met. His words were deliberate, heavy, filled with reverence as he painted the picture of two women whose friendship had once saved a family, whose sacrifices had echoed across generations. At first, Lily listened in silence, her lips parting slightly as though she struggled to breathe under the weight of the truth, and then, as his confession sank in, her eyes brimmed with tears that spilled silently down her cheeks. Her hands trembled in her lap, her chest rising and falling with uneven breaths, but what shook Ethan most was not her sadness, but the expression of recognition on her face, as though part of her had always known there was more to her story than abandonment and loss. When she finally spoke, her voice cracked with emotion, yet carried the strength of someone who had lived too many storms. So all this time, I wasn't invisible. I wasn't just forgotten. Ethan's throat tightened, and for the first time in years, he felt his carefully constructed armor begin to crumble, the cold mask of indifference that had shielded him from the world cracking under the heat of her words. He reached across the bench where they sat, his hand hesitant yet certain, and gently took hers, his grip firm, as though he were anchoring both of them against the tide of their emotions. "You were never invisible," he said, his voice low, trembling with sincerity. "You were meant to be seen, and I promise you now, you will never, ever be left to sleep on cardboard again." Lily broke then, not in despair, but in release, her tears flowing freely as she leaned against him, her sobs muffled by the fabric of his coat. For the first time in her life, she felt like more than a shadow, more than a burden carried reluctantly by a world too harsh to care. She felt seen, valued, connected to something larger than her pain. Ethan held her close, his chest tightening with an unfamiliar ache, and he realized it was not weakness, but humanity returning to him, the walls he had built brick by brick over years of loneliness and loss collapsing under the simple truth of compassion. In that fragile embrace, he found not only her healing, but his own, as though fate had drawn them together not just to uncover the past, but to mend the present. The park around them faded, the noise of the city distant, leaving only the sound of shared breaths and the unspoken vow that had passed between them. Ethan, who had once prided himself on power and control, now found himself humbled by the purity of a promise made not in boardrooms, but in the rawness of human connection. He looked at Lily, her tear-streaked face lifted toward him with a mixture of vulnerability and trust, and he knew with absolute certainty that his life could never return to what it had been. Weeks after that fateful conversation in the park, Ethan found himself standing at the entrance of his mansion, a place that had once felt more like a hollow monument to his success than a home, waiting for Lily to arrive with a suitcase that looked too small to hold a lifetime of struggle. When the gates opened and she stepped through, her hesitant smile softened the cold marble walls more than any expensive art or chandelier ever could, and for the first time, Ethan felt the weight of his house lifting, as though it had been waiting all along for someone to bring it to life. He welcomed her, not as a benefactor welcoming a guest, but as someone welcoming family. His words warm, his gestures steady, and Lily, though nervous, felt the sincerity radiating from him as she crossed the threshold into a world that seemed impossibly distant from the streets she once called home. Days passed, and the mansion began to change, its silence broken by the gentle rhythm of footsteps in hallways that had echoed empty for too long. the sound of laughter spilling into rooms that had known only the hum of solitude and the quiet joy of two people building a new rhythm together. Ethan took it upon himself not only to provide for Lily, but to nurture her dreams, sitting with her late into the evening as she spoke about the education she thought she had lost forever, encouraging her to pursue every possibility with the same determination he had once poured into his empire. He enrolled her in a prestigious school, not to boast of what he could give, but to restore to her what life had unjustly taken away. And the day she walked into her first class, her shoulders straight, her eyes bright, he felt a pride that no business deal had ever brought him. Slowly, the girl who had once slept on cardboard transformed into someone radiant with hope, her laughter softening the hard edges of Ethan's days, her kindness drawing out parts of him he thought had died with his childhood. And in return, Ethan gave her not just shelter, not just financial security, but the assurance that she belonged, that she was part of something bigger than survival. She was part of a family. Evenings in the mansion turned into moments of quiet beauty, sharing meals at a table that no longer felt too large, conversations flowing with ease, Lily's stories of her past no longer spoken with shame, but with the courage of someone who had endured and risen. Ethan listened, not as a distant figure, but as a man who cared deeply, and in her resilience, he found his own strength renewed. The loneliness that had once haunted him began to fade, replaced by a warmth he had never known, and he realized that in saving Lily, he had also been saved. Their bond grew not out of obligation, but out of shared healing, gratitude blending seamlessly with love. And what began as an unexpected encounter in a dark alley unfolded into a destiny neither of them could have imagined. The mansion, once cold and empty, now pulsed with life, its rooms carrying the energy of laughter, its halls echoing with footsteps that promised a future brighter than either of them had dared to dream. And so, the man who had built his empire on strength and solitude discovered that his greatest fortune was not measured in wealth or power, but in the quiet joy of a family found, while the girl who had once been unseen discovered that she was never forgotten, that she had been brought into the life she was always meant to have. Together, they stepped into a new beginning, one not born of pity or chance, but of love, gratitude, and destiny. A story written not in marble or money, but in the unshakable bond of two souls who had finally found home in each other.